Russia is mocking the world. Trump's team comments on the latest strike. We'll talk about this with Andriy Dobriansky, Director of Communications and Media at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Andriy, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
And thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Andriy, U.S. Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Tammy Bruce, described Russia's use of the Oreshnik ballistic missile against Ukraine as an incomprehensible escalation. According to her, Ukraine and Russia should seek a path toward de-escalation, taking into account the efforts being made by U.S. President Donald Trump to end the war through negotiations. However, instead of working toward a peaceful resolution, Russia is creating the risk of the war expanding and intensifying. But why is the response limited to words rather than concrete actions?
Correct. And you're not going to find actions at the United Nations, but it was very fortuitous that the United Nations Human Rights Council actually moved up their monthly report so that when Rosemary DiCarlo, the undersecretary, testified at the Security Council meeting that was requested by Ukraine and that 5 other Security Council members upheld that we need to have this meeting, not only was the undersecretary able to expound on what she saw when she visited Ukraine last month, but we actually have concrete numbers from the United Nations United Nations Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, stating how many civilians specifically have been targeted. And this has been the story for the last year, which we need to make sure that the rest of the world understands. When President Trump says that there's been a different war, that this is Biden's war, not his war, we need to underscore that it is an entirely different type of war than last year. We're not talking about tanks. We're not talking about personnel carriers. We are talking about an aerial bombardment every night. And that is what the rest of the world needs to act against, not thinking about the war that we fought 3 years ago at the very beginning, what kind of weapons were being sought then. But we need to be able to, effectively defend Ukraine's electricity grid, their heating supply, and at the very least, find a way of having protective cover for a part of the country. And this is something that has been discussed in Europe, but still, as you said, words, not actions.
And really, Ukraine needs additional missiles for its Patriot and NASAMS air defense systems to protect critical infrastructure from massed Russian strikes. But how do you think challenges exist in providing Ukraine with sufficient missiles to protect its critical infrastructure? And what about long-range capabilities? We saw that Britain is developing a new long-range ballistic missile for Ukraine. What about United States?
Well, we know that the United States, President Trump has still been convinced that Tomahawks are not the weapon that they need. This was a position that he was closer to ceding to earlier when he met with President Zelensky in September at the United Nations. But then within a month's time at his meeting in October, he had changed his mind. We are unfortunately in a place where the United States is a country that you cannot be convinced of going in one direction or another. It constantly vacillates based on the president's own thoughts. In his mind, the only limit on outside of international law would be the president's own morality. And basically whatever his feelings are that day, that's what the United States will do. So it's great that other countries have stepped up. You've mentioned Great Britain. We are still awaiting Germany to commit to having more Tauruses for Ukraine to match the Storm Shadows. But again, those aren't munitions that would go as far as a Tomahawk or anything longer range. So it is something that Ukraine will be seeking, because the only way to properly defend the facilities of Ukraine, you mentioned anti-air and other defensive weapons. Unfortunately, the only way to defend Ukraine is to go offensively deeper within Russia, deeper, and attack those areas that have been manufacturing the Shahed drones, manufacturing all sorts of aerial glide bombs against Ukraine, because it is always better financially to go on the offense than it is to try to defend. We saw this in Ukraine's brilliant victories in sinking numerous ships with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Russian naval ships that are sunk with tens of thousands of dollars of drone equipment. Similarly, these multi-million-dollar equipments like the Patriots and other Western weapons, they are being overwhelmed by these cheap Shahed drones and glide bombs. So in Ukraine's case, most military experts agree that what Ukraine has been doing, which is targeting deeper within Russia, is the best case scenario for Ukraine because it is the most economically viable solution for defeating Russia in the future.
Andriy, President Volodymyr Zelensky met with the Ukrainian negotiation team on the peace settlement and instructed them to finalize the coordination of security guarantees with the United States. The negotiators briefed him on their communications with the U.S. side and discussed schedules for the next 2 weeks regarding meetings, document preparation, and potential signing. The president said, what progress has been made in finalizing security guarantees between Ukraine and the United States, and what challenges remain in reaching an agreement on security guarantees?
I think the major challenge will always be President Trump. We saw that in February of last year, where President Zelensky arrived at the White House to sign a minerals agreement, only to have been ambushed by the vice president and others, which led to a delay into that signing. So the humor of President Trump will always be the issue at hand. We know that there is a great potential for something to be signed in the coming days, not just weeks, but given the fact that the Davos summit is coming up very shortly next week, we know that there is a potential for both Ukrainian and American leadership to meet in Switzerland. And at this point, both sides are openly talking about a multi-hundred-million-dollar agreement that would include security and guarantees, but more specifically for Ukraine would also guarantee Ukraine's reconstruction for the future.
Thanks to coordinated pressure from Ukraine and the number of other countries, at least 20% of such a fleet, Russian shadow fleet, has already been put out of operation. At the same time, Moscow is attempting to compensate for these losses by deploying new vessels. And the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, emphasized that all of them must be included on sanctions list. How effective have coordinated sanctions been in reducing the operational capacity of the Russian fleet?
Well, we know that sanctions have significantly diminished Russia's oil exportation. We saw a significant drop in November of last year. That was followed with the numbers that just came out for December of 2025, as well historic drops in Russian oil productivity and oil exports around the world. That is twofold. One, Ukraine has been significantly targeting Russian oil manufacturing and refining within the Russian Federation territory. Secondly, the sanctions have been put in place, especially those earlier this year by President Trump. We know that there have been too many carve-outs for them, meaning too many exceptions to the sanctions list that needs to be readdressed. One of the ways that could be readdressed is additional legislation that is being proposed both in the House of Representatives as well as the United States Senate. As with many sanctions, the President of the United States has full authority to levy these sanctions today, to increase the sanctions, especially the secondary sanctions. However, he is not willing to act, and he has been successfully blocking the United States Senate and the House of Representatives from passing legislation that would force him to do these secondary sanctions, as well as tighten up the original sanctions. So we will see where the United States goes with that. Again, we are in a situation where the president is effectively blocking Senate and is leaving the decision for sanctions up to his personal thoughts that day. That's not going to bode well for a sanctions regime. You need a coordinated effort. You need a solid agreement amongst other countries that this is the way that the Western alliance is going to go forward. And so long as we have a president in the United States that flip-flops on a daily basis, we're not going to have a successful campaign.
And we remember that U.S. seizes fifth Russian Shadow Fleet tanker in Caribbean Sea, and now we see that Britain found ground to seize hundreds of Russian Shadow Fleet oil tankers. What do you think about this?
Well, the Shadow Fleet is something that was started many years ago. Iran being the first country that was recognized as a state sponsor of terror back in the 1980s by the United States. It had to rely on surreptitious ways of selling its oil, which is a major factor in its economy. Once Russia began to be sanctioned after the invasion of Georgia, Russia slowly started to overtake the global system of Shadow Fleets. That includes regimes like Venezuela, that includes Iran, that includes any country with a significant oil output or a sanctioned regime that wants to purchase oil. This was all more or less coordinated by Russia, which is why when we saw a Venezuelan tanker or other tanker being interdicted earlier this week or last week, we saw them quickly try to switch over to a Russian flag to no avail. Because the Russian forces are simply unwilling to defend these. They don't have the capability to go up against the Western alliance, which has been the reason that people in Eastern Europe and Ukraine specifically have asked the Western alliance to beef up its retaliation or retaliate in any way as far as its airspace being violated in Moldova, Poland, and other countries. But regardless of the case, what's happening with the Shadow Fleet is not only the apprehension of the vessels, but now the whole system of the Shadow Fleet economy is being threatened with the change of leadership in Venezuela, the potential change of leadership in Iran. This throws off the careful balance that has been developed by Russia in terms of supply and demand in the Shadow Fleet. And we'll see if Russia can manage to still conduct its Shadow Fleet economy going forward.
You mentioned Iran, and the U.S. Department of State has urged Americans in Iran to leave the country immediately due to a high level of danger. How might the deteriorating security situation in Iran affect regional stability, and what's next?
It's the big question of if the United States were to intervene, given the fact that we saw the instability in many regimes where the United States intervened militarily. We can point to Libya, where the United States acted to contravene an act of war, crimes against humanity that was going to be perpetrated by Muammar Gaddafi until the United States and the NATO alliance interdicted with airstrikes. Similarly, here, the United States is considering airstrikes, although I must say that the international alliance is less united, obviously, but less inclined to do these kinds of airstrikes against Iran, given the fact that they are so outstretched right now, given this. We've already talked about the oil tankers being interdicted. We've talked about the change in Venezuela. We've talked about the fact that we haven't even brought up the fact that Syria has a new government that's only a year old. We know that the Middle East peace process is still unfolding. The problems in Somalia, etc. There are very many hot points in the world, not least of which is the largest land war in Europe that has now surpassed the time of a land war in World War II. So the European partners are looking at Iran and asking, is this the right time to make a move, given the fact that this is a much larger country than Iraq or Afghanistan. This is a country that, if it were to be thrown into chaos, has numerous rival factions that are ready to conduct a civil war. And that makes the rest of the world nervous for a change. However, President Trump believes very much in dominating the domestic news cycle so much that he might decide to bomb Iran simply to change the narrative within the United States.
How could a change of regime in Iran, in your opinion, affect Moscow's ability to receive political, military, or economic support from Tehran?
Well, political, there's little to no benefit to having Iran as an ally. Economically, we know that the entire Shahed program has been mutually beneficial for both Iran and Russia. We know that the oil economy, as I mentioned earlier, the Shadow Fleet economy, Iran is a major part of that. Without the Shadow Fleet economy that is run or logistically organized by Russia, Iran's finances would be even lower than they are today. So there are a lot of ways that Russia and Iran are wedded together to disrupt that, on top of the disruptions of Syria and Venezuela before this, would significantly limit Russia in terms of its international reach. Whether they're beneficial diplomatically or not, simply the fact that they have military allies and economic allies, that would very much hurt them.
And a little bit more about Greenland. Republican U.S. Representative Randy Finney has introduced a bill in Congress that provides for the annexation of Greenland and its admission as a U.S. state. According to Bruce, instead of working toward the peaceful resolution, Russia's actions risk expanding and intensifying the war. How seriously is Congress treating this bill, and what is its likelihood of passing?
Very, very unlikely to even have a vote. However, if the president demands something, he will ask one of these members of Congress to propose a first reading of a vote if it were to even get a reading in committee. We know that the topic of Greenland is a very serious one. President Trump does not treat it seriously enough. He seems to be okay with insulting entire nations. We saw that in February of last year when he insulted Ukraine in the Oval Office. He followed that up in March with a meeting with the representatives of South Africa, where he insulted that country. He insults numerous countries, including our close neighbors of Africa and Mexico, all the time. And he does not understand that, unlike domestic politics, insulting entire nations does not go away. It is not something that is easily forgotten. It is something that other nations will bring up decade after decade, century after century, about how one nation insulted another. So what is happening as far as Greenland is not just the verbal insult that will split the tensions within the alliance, the Western alliance, even more. But we know that if it were to be the case that President Trump has in the instance of what happened in Crimea in 2014, if he sends U.S. troops out from the army base in Greenland onto Danish territory in Greenland without prior permission, if he sends more troops there than are allowed currently under the agreement without prior notification, this would then be brought up to the NATO Council. At the NATO Council, we know that the United States has a veto, as every nation does, and therefore it could potentially signal the end of NATO, as the Danish Prime Minister just mentioned 2 days ago.
You mentioned Venezuela, and President Trump said that Venezuelan authorities should move toward normalizing relations with the United States and conclude the appropriate agreements before it's too late. Yes, President Trump wrote on the social media platform Truth Social. He specifically noted that over the past decades, Venezuela has supplied oil and paid money to Cuba in exchange for services from Cuban security agencies, including personal protection officers for Nicolas Maduro and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. How might the U.S. approach to Venezuela affect broader regional security dynamics in Latin America, and what is happening now?
Well, it's a very complicated situation because the United States abducted just the president and his wife of Venezuela, and it is the third most or fourth most corrupt country in the world. That entire leadership, other than those two people, have remained in Venezuela. We see the colectivos, the armed militias who dominate the countryside. They have gone into the streets and fired on civilians. There is no centralized control, has not been for a long time. Maduro's regime was really centralized to the major cities and let most of Venezuela, which is such a large country that is larger than France and Germany put combined, with dense forests, very unpassable areas. So to have full domination is inconceivable to begin with. But in terms of trying to work with that economy, as I mentioned, it is a very corrupt country, twice as many generals in its army than other countries would have. These generals are what we would refer to as oligarchs in Eastern Europe or warlords in Africa. They dominate their area. They have a percentage in terms of the grift they take from the local economy. And these are the people that President Trump is proposing work with the United States in some kind of economic fashion. I think he'll discover that it's very much difficult to work with corrupt regimes unless he supports some kind of popular vote in Venezuela to change the government altogether. But that's not something that he's interested in. He is interested primarily, he has openly talked about the oil. of Venezuela and trying to dominate the world oil market by combining the combined reserves of the United States and Venezuela. That would represent more than a third of the known oil deposits in the world, and therefore he could control the oil pricing in the world if he could dominate the oil market of Venezuela. But he is also worried about, or the National Security Staff of the United States is worried about China's influence, as well as Iran and other countries, but specifically China's influence in South and Central America and their closeness of establishing a base of operations so close to the Panama Canal, the control of which would prevent the United States, Asia, and the Southeast Asian Sea by blocking the deployment of American ships who are currently in the Atlantic Ocean.
Andriy, thank you so much for this interesting and very important conversation. Thanks for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Andriy Dobriansky, Director of Communications and Media at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, was with us today. Please share this interview and continue supporting Ukraine. Andriy, I wish you all the best and see you.
Thank you so much. Until next time.